Today, you will learn AP Microeconomics in one video. Throughout the video, there will be several very useful concepts, including how businesses and individuals can make the most of their budgets, how businesses can maximize and calculate profits, and the effect of government intervention on supply, demand, and production. The video will be ordered by the units in AP Micro. Here they are, as well as their approximate weights on the AP exam. At the end of each unit, there will be a review that goes over the key takeaways from that unit. Let's get started with Unit 1, which is an introduction to economics and rational decision-making. Economics is a branch dealing with the production, distribution, and consumption of goods and services. The need for economics comes from the fundamental problem of economics based on scarcity, which is the idea that there are limited resources for production, but wants are unlimited. Examples of scarce resources include workers, because there's only a finite number of people, and each worker is only willing to work for a limited amount of time, and machines, because those are also finite. Non-rival resources are not scarce. An example would be knowledge, because one person having a piece of knowledge, such as the equation E equals mc squared, doesn't prevent other people from having it as well. Resources are grouped into 4 factors of production. The first is land, also known as natural resources, because it includes not only land, but also other natural goods such as water and air. So this is basically anything that comes from the environment. Labor is people's effort, so this is any worker that you can think of. Capital is something produced to produce another good. Examples include factory buildings, which hold workers and machines that produce a good, machines, and trucks. Trucks is a tricky one, but it transports goods, and getting goods to a place where consumers can buy them is part of the production process. And finally, entrepreneurship, a person who combines the other factors of production. So this is typically people who make decisions. And note that money is not a factor of production because it is not involved in the production of something itself. It's used as a medium of exchange. You can use it to buy one of the other factors of production, but you're not using the money itself to produce something. Economic systems are mechanisms for deciding on 3 key questions. What to make, so this deals with the allocation of resources. How to make it, this deals with production of products, and who gets it, this deals with distribution. In a market economy, individuals make decisions and have private property rights to what they produce. The prices are set by supply and demand. The reason why a market economy works is because of something called the invisible hand, which is the idea that individuals, when pursuing their own interests, benefit the economy as a whole. So when someone's pursuing their own interest of making money, they could do that by producing products, and that leads to extra products for the entire economy. There are some problems with the market economy, and later we'll see how the government can resolve them. In a command economy, the government makes decisions and sets goals, and there are no private property rights. These don't work because there is no incentive to invest, because without private property rights, people wouldn't be able to keep what they produce even if they make a good investment. Hence, there is no reward for investing. And there's also no incentive to improve quality or innovate, because since the government sets goals, people just need to achieve them, which is the bare minimum. These 2 economic systems are both at extreme ends, and many economies today are somewhere in between. So the government does have a role in the economy, but the individuals still make many important decisions. Opportunity cost is the value of the best foregone alternative when you choose between mutually exclusive options. Mutually exclusive means that you can only choose one of them. Here's an example. If Alice prefers a cherry over an apple, a banana over a cherry, and a kiwi over a banana, and she is only allowed to choose one of these fruits to eat, what is the opportunity cost of choosing a kiwi? The answer is a banana, because that is the best alternative that she would have if she did not choose a kiwi. The law of increasing opportunity cost states that as more and more of a good is produced, the opportunity cost of producing the good increases. The reason is the resources that are best suited for producing a good are used first, and once they are used, producing more requires resources that are less suited for producing it, so more resources are required. And since more resources are required, that is an increasing opportunity cost. Now we're getting into our first graph of this video, the production possibilities curve. And the production possibilities curve shows possible combinations of amounts of two goods that can be produced. An example of two goods that we can plot on them are capital goods and consumer goods. And we have some values listed in the table. And if we plot them down and then draw a curve to connect them, we have the production possibilities curve. Any point that is inside but not on the production possibilities curve is under allocation because we're not using all the resources that we have and we're not producing the maximum amount that we could be producing. A point that is outside the production possibilities curve is impossible because given the limited resources that we have, we cannot produce that combination of goods. The shape of the production possibilities curve shows the law of increasing opportunity costs because, for example, to go from 3 to 4 capital goods requires sacrificing a larger amount of consumer goods than going from 2 to 3 capital goods. So the fact that the production possibilities curve curves outward shows the law of increasing opportunity costs. If the line is straight, then it means that opportunity costs are constant, and if it bends inwards, then there's decreasing opportunity costs. The production possibilities curve can shift. If there's economic growth, then it will shift outward, which means that some combinations of goods that were previously unattainable are now possible. And if there's economic decline, then the curve will shift inward. Now we're getting into comparative advantage and trade. Trade is beneficial to economies because it can help them attain combinations that are beyond the production possibilities curve. So suppose that country A can produce either 200 apples or 400 oranges, and country B can produce either 400 apples or 600 oranges. And we're also going to assume constant opportunity costs and that each country will produce only one good. And if each country wants both fruits, what country should produce each, and what should the terms of trade be? All right, to solve this, first we should know what is absolute advantage and what is comparative advantage. Absolute advantage is when one economy can produce more of a good than the other. And comparative advantage is when one economy can produce a good at a lower opportunity cost than the other. And to solve the problem that we just saw, each economy should produce the good which it has a comparative advantage in. And later we'll see why it's impossible for one economy to have a comparative advantage in both goods. So, who has the absolute advantage in each good? The answer is country B for both goods because it can produce 400 apples while country A can only produce 200, and it can produce 600 oranges while country A can produce only 400. So now who has the comparative advantage in apples? To determine this, we would find the opportunity cost of producing apples for each country. Country A can produce either 400 oranges or 200 apples, so if we divide them, we'll get that their opportunity cost is 2 oranges for every apple. And country B has an opportunity cost of 1.5 oranges for every apple. So since country B sacrifices fewer oranges for every apple, country B has a comparative advantage in apples. And to determine which country has the comparative advantage in oranges, we can just take the reciprocal. And we'll see that country A has the comparative advantage in oranges. All right, so now the terms of trade. So we've established which good each country has a comparative advantage in. So country A produces 400 oranges and country B produces 400 apples. We have the opportunity cost of producing apples for each country listed here, and the terms of trade must be in between these two opportunity costs because, for example, if it was lower than 1.5 oranges per apple, then country B would not be willing to purchase oranges from country A because they could get more oranges by producing oranges themselves. And similarly, if it was greater than 2 oranges per apple, then country A would not be willing to purchase apples. So we must pick any number in between these two opportunity costs, such as 1.75. So country A trades 7 oranges for every 4 apples from country B. All right. And sometimes you will see the numbers not listed as how many of a product each firm or country can produce, but instead how long it takes them to produce it. And for these problems, you can take the reciprocal of the numbers to find how many of the product each firm or country can produce in a certain amount of time. And then with that, you can solve the problem normally. For example, finding which good each firm or country has a comparative advantage in. All right, now we're getting into cost benefit analysis. The idea is that individuals and businesses make the best decisions by maximizing the difference between total benefits and total costs, which must include explicit and implicit or opportunity costs. So here's an example problem. Adam decides to start a business. He spends $200,000 in expenses to start the business and earns $255,000 in revenue during the first year. If he didn't start the business, could have instead worked as an accountant, earning a salary of $50,000 and placed the $200,000 he spent in a savings account with an annual interest rate of 3%. What are the explicit and implicit costs of running the business for a year? All right, the explicit cost will just be the $200,000 spent. And then the implicit cost includes the foregone salary of $50,000 and the foregone interest, which is $6,000. So the total implicit costs are $56,000. Now, accounting profit is revenue minus explicit costs. So this is how much money was earned, while economic profit is revenue minus explicit and implicit costs. So this is how much money was earned relative to the best alternative use of your money and time. So now we're being asked, what are the accounting and economic profits of running the business for a year? Well, the accounting profit would just be $255,000 minus $200,000, which is $55,000. And for accounting profit, we also subtract the $56,000 in implicit costs to get negative $1,000. And since the accounting profit is negative, it means that Adam is actually losing money by running the business because he could be earning more money by doing something else. The next topic we're getting into is utility, which is the satisfaction derived from consuming a good. So we have a table showing the number of ice cream cones eaten and the corresponding utility for each quantity. And marginal utility is the additional utility from consuming an additional unit. The way you find this is by taking the utility of the current quantity minus the utility of the previous quantity. So for one ice cream cone, the marginal utility would be 8 minus 0, which is 8. For two ice cream cones, it would be 14 minus 8, which is 6, and so on for 3 and 4. And notice how in the end, marginal utility becomes negative. And the reason for this is because once you've eaten too many ice cream cones, eating more probably won't make you feel much more satisfied and will probably cause problems like feeling overfed. And closely related to the topic of utility is marginal benefit versus marginal cost analysis, which states that the optimal quantity is where marginal benefit equals marginal cost. And the reason for this is because before that quantity, consuming an additional unit will have a benefit that's greater than the cost because marginal benefit is greater than marginal cost. But after that point, consuming an additional unit will incur a cost that's greater than the benefit. So if we have a situation similar to what we had last slide, and we express marginal utility in terms of dollars, then we can see from this graph that the optimal quantity is 2. And the reason why marginal cost is constant is because we're assuming a fixed price for the good. In the real world, there could be some other factors such as deals for purchasing larger amounts that influence it, but we're just going to keep it simple and make it horizontal. All right, here's another example where we have liters of runoff prevented on the x-axis. And the reason why marginal cost is rising this time is because of the law of increasing opportunity costs. So now we're getting into utility maximization using marginal utility analysis. So this deals with having two goods and a fixed budget and deciding what quantity of the two goods to purchase to maximize utility. So the way you do this is find the marginal utility per dollar of each quantity of each good. So since bagels cost $2 and toy cars cost $1, you divide the marginal utility of bagels for each quantity by 2 and of toy cars by 1 to get this. And then at each incremental purchase, choose the option that provides the highest marginal utility per dollar. So for the first good, we see that the marginal utility per dollar of toy cars is 10, which is greater than 4. So we choose toy cars. All right. And then now we have 8 versus 4. 8 is still greater. And then we have 6 versus 4. 6 is still greater. And now we have 4 for each. So we can just purchase both at this point. And now how much money have we spent? We spent $2 on bagels and $4 on toy cars. So we have $5 left. All right. So for the next good, the marginal utility per dollar of bagels is 3.5, which is greater than 3. All right. And then we have 3 for both goods. So we can purchase both goods. And now we've spent $11 in total. And notice how in the end, the marginal utility per dollar of each good will be equal. And the reason is because by constantly choosing the good with the higher marginal utility per dollar, you're constantly narrowing the gap between the marginal utility per dollar of the two goods until that gap becomes 0. The last topic for this unit is the circular flow of income. You don't need to remember this. This will not be tested, but it gives you a good idea of what's coming in the future units. So basically what this states is that firms or businesses spend their money in the factor market on resources, such as workers. And then this money goes to households, who are the suppliers of the workers. And then households, they spend their money in the product market to purchase goods. And then from the product market, that money goes to the firms, which are the producers of those goods. So in units 2, 3, and 4, we will talk about the product market. And in unit 5, we will apply what we've learned about the product market to talk about the factor market. So now we're all done with unit 1. And here's the review. Pause whenever you need to read over the points. So first, here are the 4 factors of production. And then here are market systems. And then the production possibilities curve and opportunity cost. Trade. Cost-benefit analysis. And finally, utility maximization using marginal utility analysis. Now we're beginning unit 2, supply and demand. This is one of the most important units of the course, but don't worry if you find yourself struggling, because future units will cover some similar concepts, which will act as a good review of the concepts in this unit. So first is demand. Demand is the amount of a good that consumers are willing to purchase at a certain price. And the law of demand states that a higher price of a good will cause a lower demand for that good. And this is pretty intuitive, because if you have to pay more for a good, then you'd be less willing to buy it. The market demand curve is found by horizontally adding the individual demand curves. So the individual demand curves might look something like this, with price on the y-axis and quantity on the x-axis. And these all follow the law of demand, because as price increases, individual demand decreases. And if you add them together horizontally, which means at each price, you add together the quantity that each individual is willing to purchase, you get the market demand curve. So here are the determinants of demand, which form the acronym INSECT. I encourage you not to remember all of them, because most of them are pretty intuitive. Just focus on remembering the blue terms, because those might be unfamiliar. The first determinant is income. Normal goods have demand that rises as income rises, and this is consistent with the income effect, which states that if consumers have more income and thus more to spend, then they would demand and purchase more goods. Inferior goods have demand that falls as income rises. So these are typically goods that are more basic but less expensive. For example, small houses. If consumers don't have a lot of income, then they would purchase more small houses because they're less expensive. But if consumers get more income, then they would purchase fewer small houses in favor of larger houses. And then number of buyers. If there are more buyers, then there would be more demand. Substitute goods. So the substitution effect states that demand of a good rises as price of a substitute rises. An example of 2 substitutes are Coke and Pepsi. If the price of Coke rises, then some consumers will turn to purchasing Pepsi, because Pepsi is now less expensive relative to Coke, so therefore the demand for Pepsi rises. expectation of future price. Present demand is higher if price is expected to rise because consumers would want to purchase it right now before the prices rise. Complementary goods, which are goods that are often used together, and demand falls as demand of complement falls. So an example of complementary goods are bread and butter. If people demand less bread, then they would also demand less butter. And then finally, taste. So what consumers want. And then supply is the amount of a good that producers are willing to purchase at a certain price. The law of supply states that a higher price of a good will cause a higher supply for that good, because a higher price means that the good is more profitable. So suppliers would be more willing to produce it. All right. And similarly, the market supply curve is found by horizontally adding the individual supply curves. Here are the determinants of supply, which form the acronym PETting. Once again, I encourage you not to put too much effort into remembering them. The first determinant is the prices of other goods that firms can produce, and supply is higher if price of other goods is lower. So for example, if a firm produces tennis balls and tennis rackets, then if the price of tennis balls decreases, then that means tennis balls are now less profitable relative to tennis rackets, so the firm will turn to producing more rackets, and thus the supply of tennis rackets increases. Expectations of future price, present supply is higher if price is expected to fall because firms want to sell it now before the price falls. Technology, if there's better technology, then firms can produce and supply more. Taxes and subsidy, we will get into more detail about this later, but briefly, taxes mean that some of the profit that firms make has to go to the government, and that would decrease the supply because now firms have less incentive since they make less profits, whereas subsidies means that the government gives the firm money for producing the good, and that would increase the incentive to produce and therefore the supply. Input costs, so supply falls as input costs rise because if it's more expensive to produce, then firms will produce less. Number of sellers, if there's more sellers, then there would be more supply. And finally, government regulations. If there are more regulations, firms would face less profit, which would decrease the supply. Now we're getting into elasticity, which is a measure of how responsive something is to a change in something else. The price elasticity of demand measures how much quantity changes in response to changes in price, and it's equal to the absolute value of the percentage change in quantity demanded divided by the percentage change in price. And percentage change is equal to 100 times the new amount minus the old amount divided by the old amount. And since we have 100 in both the numerator and denominator, they cancel out. And the reason we have an absolute value is because otherwise the elasticity coefficient would be negative. And economists don't like to have the negative sign, so they just get rid of it. And the higher the value of this coefficient, the more responsive quantity demanded is to changes in price. So here's a sample problem. The price of a flash drive used to be $10 and 100 flash drives were sold at that price. The price is raised to $12 and 40 flash drives are sold at this price. What is the price elasticity of demand for flash drives? Pause the video here if you'd like to give this a try. All right, here comes the solution. So you just plug in the values into the equation and you get that the answer is 3. Here are the determinants of price elasticity of demand. These will probably not be tested, so don't put too much effort into remembering them. The first is substitutes. If there are more substitutes available, then the good is more elastic because people will have more alternatives to turn to if the price increases. Therefore, the quantity demanded is more responsive to price changes. If the substitutes are more similar, then the good will also be more elastic because some people might still prefer the good due to a unique feature that it has, but if the substitutes are more similar, then this is less likely to be the case. Want versus need. Needs, such as medicine, are less elastic because people will still need them even if the price increases, so the quantity demanded is not very responsive to price changes. Time frame. In the short term, goods are less elastic. Let's say, for example, it's raining and some people don't have their umbrella. If they're offered to purchase an umbrella, then they would be less responsive to price differences because In the short term, they're probably thinking about not getting wet. But in the long term, for example, if it's forecasted to rain tomorrow, then they would have more time to consider alternative places where they can get umbrellas, and therefore the good is more elastic. Share of income. A lower share of income, it means that the good is less elastic. For example, apples, they don't cost much, usually less than $1. And so people really often don't care about price increases. But if the good is really expensive, such as a house, then people will definitely need to consider price differences because of affordability issues. And then describing elasticity, an elasticity coefficient of infinity means that demand is perfectly elastic, which means we have a horizontal demand curve. So as we can see in this graph, the buyers are all willing to pay $3 for the good, which means that the sellers can sell any quantity at $3, but if they raise the price by even 1 cent, nobody will be willing to purchase it. An elasticity coefficient between 1 and infinity means that demand is elastic. An elasticity coefficient of 1 means that the demand is unit elastic. Between 0 and 1 means inelastic. And 0 means perfectly inelastic, which means we have a vertical demand curve. And as we can see in this graph, the sellers can sell 3,000 units regardless of what the price is. The total revenue test tells us that if revenue decreases as price and quantity increase, or the other way around, demand is elastic. If revenue doesn't change as price and quantity change, then unit elastic. And if revenue increases as price and quantity increase, or for that matter, revenue decreases as price and quantity decrease, then demand is inelastic. And there's a fun way to remember this. If revenue and price and quantity move in the same direction, then we can imagine 2 arrows and a brick in between the tips of those 2 arrows. And a brick is inelastic because it's not easy to change its shape even if you try to bend it. Whereas if revenue and price and quantity move in opposite directions, then we can imagine a rubber band in between the tips of those 2 arrows. And a rubber band is elastic because it's easy to stretch it and change its shape. And now elasticity along a linear demand curve. So on the left, the demand is elastic. In the middle, demand is unit elastic. And on the right, the demand is inelastic. And this is a result of the total revenue test because revenue is equal to price times quantity. So for example, if the price is at $4, then this rectangle represents our total revenue. And if we increase the price, then the area of this rectangle would decrease. And as we know, if price increases and revenue decreases, then that means that demand is elastic. The price elasticity of supply measures how much quantity supplied changes in response to changes in price. It's equal to the percentage change in quantity supplied divided by the percentage change in price. And we don't need an absolute value because it's already going to be positive. There's only one determinant of the price elasticity of supply, which is the time frame. In the short term, it will be less elastic. So let's say, for example, the price of corn were to suddenly double. Farmers would be really happy, but it's not like they can suddenly increase the supply in just the next day because corn takes a long time to grow. And if they were suddenly to just plant a lot more corn seeds today, then that would increase the supply several months from now during the next harvest. So therefore, in the short term, the quantity supplied is less responsive to price. And there are 2 other elasticities in this course. The first is income elasticity of demand, which is percentage change in quantity demanded divided by percentage change in income. If it's positive, then that means that demand increases as income increases, so the good is normal. If it's negative, then the good is inferior. The cross elasticity of demand is the percentage change in quantity of good X demanded over the percentage change in the price of good Y. And if it's positive, then it will be consistent with the substitution effect, so X and Y are substitutes. And if it's negative, then X and Y are complementary. So now we're done with elasticity, and we're into our next topic of market equilibrium. The market will automatically adjust the quantity and price to the intersection of the market and supply and demand curves. To see why this is true, if we suppose that the price was greater than the market equilibrium price, then there would be more supply than demand, and some producers would not be able to sell their goods. So they would offer a lower price to the buyers, and that would shift the price down. Similarly, if the price was below the equilibrium price, then there would be more quantity demanded than supplied, and so the people who are not able to purchase it will be willing to pay the producers more money, and that would increase the price. So the price automatically adjusts, and at the equilibrium price, the quantity supplied and demanded are the same. The equilibrium can shift. A change in demand is a shift of the demand curve due to a change in one of the determinants of demand, while a change in quantity demanded is a movement along the demand curve due to a change in price. So the main distinction is a change in demand is a shift of the curve, while a change in quantity demanded is a movement along the curve. And the same is true for supply. Here's an example of a shift. Bread and butter are complementary goods. The price of butter decreases, causing the demand for butter to increase. Show the impact this will have on the market for bread. All right, so the first thing you need to know is, will it shift to supply or demand? The answer is demand, because complementary goods are one of the determinants of demand. And since bread and butter are consumed together and the demand for butter increase, that means that the demand for bread will increase as well, which means a rightward shift of the demand curve, because at each possible price, the demand for bread will be higher than it previously was. All right, and then now make sure you label these as P1 and Q1 respectively to show that they're the new equilibrium. So now we're getting into consumer and producer surplus. And as part of this, you'll see that the supply curve is actually the same as the marginal cost curve, while the demand curve is the same as the marginal benefit curve. The purchaser of the 1,000th unit is willing to pay at most $6, as we can see from the demand curve, but only pays $3 at the market price. And the fact that they're willing to pay at most $6 means that to them, the good is worth $6 of benefit, because if the cost of the good was greater than their perceived benefit, then they would not be willing to purchase the good. So they get $6 of benefit from the good, but only pay $3 at the market price. So they get a consumer surplus of $3. And similarly, the purchaser of the 2,000th unit is willing to pay at most $4.80, but only gets $3 at the market price. They get a consumer surplus of $1.80. And then the producer of the 1,000th unit is willing to sell at least $1, which means that to them, the cost of producing the good is $1, because if they were to sell the good at less than their perceived cost, they would not be willing to produce it. But they get $3 at the market price, so they get a producer surplus of $2. And the producer of the 2,000th unit is willing to sell at least $2, but gets $3 at the market price, so they get a producer surplus of $1. Now you may see where we're going with this. To find the total consumer surplus, we add up the consumer surplus for each unit. Now the blue lines obviously can't show every single unit since the quantity is in thousands, but if you add all of them up, you're going to get this area right here. And similarly, for the producer surplus, you're going to get this area right here. And now we're at a state called allocative efficiency, which means that total economic surplus is maximized. And this occurs at the quantity where marginal benefit equals marginal cost. So as you can see, the market automatically drives the price to an equilibrium price and the quantity to an allocatively efficient amount. And now there's a relationship between the amount of surplus and elasticity. So as you can see here, the demand is relatively inelastic because it's quite steep, while the supply is more elastic. And as you can see, the consumer surplus is much greater than the producer surplus. So this shows that if the demand is more inelastic, there's more consumer surplus, while if the supply is more inelastic, then there's more producer surplus. So now that we've learned about consumer and producer surplus, we can talk about the effects of government intervention. The first thing that we're going to talk about is price ceilings. So let's suppose that the government thinks that a good is too expensive and sets a maximum price for which you can sell it, which in this case will be $2. All right, as you can see, the quantity demanded at this price is greater than the quantity supplied. and we have a shortage of 2,000 units. So only 2,000 units are sold in the end. And therefore, we get this area of producer and consumer surplus. And notice how we lost this area of surplus. And this area is called deadweight loss. So the government imposing a price ceiling on an allocatively efficient market just made it less efficient. To fix the issue of the shortage, the government may need to take other measures, such as giving permits to consumers that limit the amount of the good that they can purchase. And similarly, if we have a price floor because the government thinks that the producers don't earn enough, then we were going to have more quantity supplied than demanded, and that will result in a surplus. And so only 2,000 units are sold in this case. So the producer and consumer surpluses are as shown, and we have this area of deadweight loss. Since the producers are going to produce units that won't be purchased, the government may need to take measures such as purchasing the good themselves, and then they'll either have to use it or dispose of it. So as we can see, there are clearly a lot of problems with price floors and price ceilings, and that's why many governments are now using them less and less. And there's still a lasting controversy over minimum wage because on one hand, while it's meant to ensure that people have enough money to sustain themselves, it can also lead businesses to employ less workers, and that could increase unemployment. One other thing to note is that price ceilings and price floors will only have an effect if they're binding. If we have a non-binding price ceiling or floor, which is a price ceiling above the equilibrium price or a price floor below the equilibrium price, then nothing will change because the price will just stay at the equilibrium. So now what about per unit taxes? If the government sets a tax of $1 per unit sold, what would happen? Well, the supply curve will shift upward because in the eyes of the consumers, for every possible price, the quantity supplied is now what it would be for a price that was $1 lower if there wasn't the tax. So now we've established a new equilibrium, and the total consumer surplus is this area right over here, and the producers get $1 less than the price that the consumers pay, so they get this area of producer surplus. And now the tax revenue is the tax value, which is this distance right over here, times the quantity sold. So this is the area of the tax revenue, and we have this area of deadweight loss. The next topic is the incidence of tax on producers and consumers. The incidence of tax on producers would be the new equilibrium quantity times the difference between the original equilibrium price and the new amount that the producers receive for each unit sold. So that would be this area right over here. And then the consumer instance of tax is the new equilibrium quantity times the difference between the new equilibrium price and the original equilibrium price. So that would be this area right over here. And as you can see, since the consumer surplus is larger due to the fact that demand is more inelastic than supply, the consumer instance of tax is also larger. And now the last topic for this unit is international trade. So if we have several countries that open their economies to world trade, what would be the result? Well, the world supply and demand curves are found by horizontally adding market supply and demand curves. So if these are the individual market supply and demand curves for a good, then if we add them horizontally, we will have the world supply and demand curves. And we have a world equilibrium price that applies to all the countries that open their economy to trade. Each country will export or import goods to account for the surpluses or shortages at this price. Now let's talk about tariffs. Tariffs are per unit taxes on imports, and one of their purposes is to protect domestic producers of a good. So let's suppose that the world price of a good is $1.50. And as we can see from this graph, in this economy, domestic producers produce about 1,500 units at that price, and domestic consumers demand 4,000 units. So that means that the remaining 2,500 units are imported. And that means that these are the areas of the producer and consumer surplus currently. Now, if a tariff of $1 is imposed, then it would shift the world supply curve up by $1. And at this new price, domestic producers would produce more, but domestic consumers would demand less. So these are the new areas of the producer and consumer surplus. And then this is the new quantity that's imported. And the total tax revenue is the amount of the tax times the quantity imported. So that's this area right over here. And compared to what we originally had, we have these two areas which represent our total deadweight loss. So as you can see, the total domestic producer surplus has increased, but consumer and total economic surplus have decreased. And there's also a negative effect on the country that's exporting these goods since they export less, but that's not shown on this graph because this graph only shows domestic surplus. And then quotas are limits on the amount of good that can be imported. So that's all you need to know. But if you're curious, they have basically the same effect as a tariff, except instead of tax revenue, the revenue goes to the foreign country that's exporting the good, because that country can charge a higher price since imports are now limited. Before we start our review, I will say that the only topics in this unit that will not show up again in future units are calculating elasticity and tariffs. So if you're struggling with any topic that's not those two, then I would suggest not going back because you're going to see it and review it again in a future unit anyway. But anyway, here's the review of unit 2. Pause to read over the points. Here's elasticity, government intervention, and finally, world trade and tariffs. Now we're getting into Unit 3, which is a deeper dive into rational decision-making for firms. The first topic is the production function, which shows how much output is created for various different inputs. So examples of inputs could be the number of workers that you hire, the number of machines that you use, and they could also be non-numerical values such as the size of your factory. If you plug all of those into your production function, then it will give you the quantity of output. The short run versus long run. In microeconomics, the short run is defined as the time period in which at least one input is fixed, whereas the long run is the time period where all inputs can be adjusted. If it takes a week to hire new workers, a month to receive a purchase of steel, and 3 years to build a new factory, what time period is the short run? The answer is 3 years, because during those 3 years, at least one input, which is the number of factories that you have, is fixed. The next topic is total, marginal, and average product. And these show different output measures for different amounts of one input, such as workers, assuming other inputs are fixed. So as we can see here, we have the number of workers, and it gives us the total product for each quantity of workers. And now we can determine the marginal product and average product. The marginal product for one worker would be 10 minus 0, which is 10. For two workers, 22 minus 10, which is 12, and so on. And notice how marginal product initially increases, but then decreases. The reason for this is because for small quantities of workers, there could be specialization. For example, if you have a farm and you employ only one worker, they would have to do all the work. But if you employ two workers, then one person could specialize in planting the crops, while the other person specializes in giving fertilizer and water. And so these two people combined could be more productive than one person alone. But then eventually diminishing returns occur because once there are too many workers, then people will have to wait to use a certain tool, and then it could get too crowded. Average product is total product over amount of input. So for one worker, it would be 10 divided by 1, which is 10. For two workers, it's 22 divided by 2, which is 11, and so on. And now I'll graph those three measures for you. So total product forms this curve right over here. Marginal product forms this curve, and average product forms this curve. And notice how marginal product intersects average product at the average product's maximum. And the intuitive proof for that is because if you have a set of numbers and you add another number which is greater than the current average of that set, then the average of that set will increase. Whereas if you add another number that is lower than the average, then the new average will be lower. And so originally marginal product's greater than average product, so it increases. but after they intersect, marginal product becomes lower than average product, so average product decreases. The next topic is short-run fixed and variable cost. Fixed costs stay constant and are equal to total costs at 0 units of output. So as we said, the short run is the period where at least one input is fixed, and fixed costs would be the total costs of these fixed inputs. An example of a fixed cost is rent. It's constant and cannot be changed in the short run. Variable costs depend on the amount of output. An example is payment to workers, because depending on how much you want to produce, you get to decide how many workers to hire. And remember, just like we did in Unit 1, we include implicit costs. So now we're getting into short-run total cost, marginal cost, average total cost, average fixed cost, and average variable cost. So we have output and total cost given to us, and to calculate marginal cost, which is additional cost for one additional unit, for 100 units of output, it would be 10,000 minus 5,000. And then since marginal cost is the additional cost for one additional unit, and we're going in increments of 100 units of output, we have to divide by 100. So we get $50 as the marginal cost for 100 units of output. And for 200 units, it would be 14,000 minus 10,000 divided by 100, which is 40, and so on for 300, 400, and 500. And notice how marginal cost first decreases and then increases, and this is also consistent with specialization and diminishing returns. And then average total cost is total cost over output. So for 100 units of output, it's 10,000 divided by 100, and so on for the other numbers. Average fixed cost is total fixed cost, which is the total cost at 0 units of output divided by output. All right, so that's also pretty easy to calculate. And then average variable cost is average total cost minus average fixed cost. So since total cost minus fixed cost gives you variable cost, average total cost minus average fixed cost would give you average variable cost. All right, so you can calculate the average variable cost for each quantity of output. All right, and then if you graph them, it will look something like this. And then some important points are, just like we saw with marginal product, marginal cost intersects average total cost and average variable cost at their minimums. And then average total cost and average variable cost are U-shaped, and average fixed cost constantly decreases. If you're asked to graph these on the exam, then you need to keep these 3 points in mind. And then something that's not important but worth noting is that average variable cost and marginal cost start at the same point. So for the first increment of output, they're equal. And while you're not going to lose points on the exam, if you don't show this, it's still worth noting. Now we're adding in the marginal revenue curve. That curve is horizontal if price is fixed, because if the price is fixed, then for every additional unit produced, you get to sell it at that fixed price. So you make that amount in additional revenue. To maximize profits, produce at the quantity where marginal revenue equals marginal cost, because below that quantity, producing an additional unit would give you more revenue than cost. But once you reach that quantity, the cost of producing an additional unit is greater than the revenue. Now we're getting into long-run average total cost. In the long run, costs aren't fixed. For example, you can choose what size of factory you want to rent. Suppose that you're currently renting a medium-sized factory. The short-run average total cost curve for that might look something like this. Now suppose that demand for your product decreases, so now you only want to produce about 100 units of output. In that case, you can change to a smaller size factory, and that would have lower fixed costs because it has lower rent, and that would be more suitable for low amounts of output. But for larger amounts of output, it would not be efficient. And similarly, if demand increased and now you want to produce more goods, then you can change to a larger size factory, which has more fixed costs, but is more efficient for larger quantities of output. By connecting these curves, you get the long-run average total cost curve. So the long-run average total cost is also U-shaped and is made up of many short-run average total cost curves. But why is it U-shaped? Well, when we have decreasing long-run average total costs, we're in a state called economies of scale, and some possible causes include increased specialization, which we talked about previously, and deals for larger purchases. If you want to purchase large amounts of inputs, then the sellers of those inputs might lower the price for you. And then once we have increasing long-run average total costs, we're in a state called diseconomies of scale. And some possible causes are that the firm is too large and it gets hard to manage, and hiring more workers requires higher wages because the supply of workers is limited. And if you want to increase the supply of workers, the price of the workers might increase. And when we're at the minimum long-run average total cost, we're at a state called minimum efficient scale. And this slide is not really important. It might get tested, but don't spend too much effort remembering it because it's pretty intuitive. So increasing returns to scale means that output increases by more than increase in inputs. So for example, increasing all inputs by 70% increases outputs by 80%, which is greater than 70. And you can probably deduce already what's the case for decreasing and constant returns of scale. The next topic is perfect competition. Some characteristics include there are a large number of firms producing completely identical products. The reason why completely identical is important is because it means each firm's demand is perfectly elastic. So let's suppose that the market price for oranges is $1.50 per pound. If you charge $1.51, nobody's going to buy from you because they can get completely identical oranges from someone else at a cheaper price. And each firm makes up negligible amount of market output. This is important because, as we saw, the market supply curve is formed by adding together the individual supply curves. So if one firm produces more, then it could shift that curve. But if each firm makes up a negligible amount of market output, then that change is negligible. And there are no barriers to entry, so firms can freely enter as they want. The firms are price takers, which means that they sell at the market price. So each firm's demand is perfectly elastic, and so they can't sell anything at a price higher than that, and they can sell any amount of output at the market price. So there's no reason to charge a price lower than that. In the real world, completely perfect competition is not possible because completely identical products are not possible, since even factors such as where the products are sold are considered differences. However, some markets, such as agricultural products, come pretty close to perfect competition. Here are two side-by-side graphs for perfect competition. As you'll see, the price is set by the intersection of the market supply and demand curves, and that price carries over to the firm. And the total revenue of the firm is the marginal revenue or price times the quantity of output, and the total cost is average total cost times the quantity of output. And since profits are revenue minus cost, this area bound by the price, average total cost, and quantity is the profit. Firms' decisions to enter and leave. If the price is greater than the minimum average total cost, then firms make economic profit. And since firms make economic profit, more firms will enter in the long run because other people are going to be like, hey, I can make more money by producing this good than what I'm currently doing. If the price is equal to the minimum average total cost, firms make a normal profit or zero economic profit, which means that they're making just as much as they would be with the next best alternative use of their money and time. And firms will neither enter nor leave in this case because they will earn neither more nor less by switching to an alternative use of their money and time. If the price is between the minimum average variable cost and minimum average total cost, then firms will produce to minimize loss in the short run because the fixed costs have already been paid. And since the price is greater than the minimum average variable cost, producing results in fewer losses than not producing. But in the long run, firms will leave because they're still producing at a loss. And if price is less than minimum average variable cost, firms shut down and leave immediately because producing will only give them more losses. In the long run, the firms will produce where price equals minimum average total cost and make a normal profit. Producing at the minimum average total cost is called productive efficiency. The reason for this long-run equilibrium is because if price is greater than the minimum average total cost, then firms will enter, which will result in more sellers, causing the market supply curve to shift right and price to decrease. Whereas if price is less than minimum average total cost, firms will leave, causing the market supply curve to shift left and price to increase. So these two balance out so that the price equals minimum average total cost. So now we're all done with Unit 3. Here is the review. Pause to read over the points. Here's the long run. And finally, here's perfect competition. Now that we've learned about perfect competition, Unit 4 will cover imperfect competition. There are three types of imperfect competition. In a monopoly, there is only one firm selling the product. That firm is a price maker, which means that they get to decide what price to sell the product at. And there are very high barriers to entry, which ensures that competing firms cannot enter. In an oligopoly, there are a small number of firms selling identical or differentiated products. There's interdependence, which means that each firm's decisions influence the other firms, and high barriers to entry, which keeps the number of firms small. In monopolistic competition, there are a large number of firms selling differentiated products and low to no barriers to entry. The key difference between perfect and imperfect competition is that in imperfect competition, to sell more of a product, the price must be lowered, and we'll see why this is true later. Here are some examples of barriers to entry. The first is economies of scale, or decreasing long-run average total cost. So if a firm cannot achieve decreasing long-run average total cost and thus faces higher long-run average total cost, then they might not be able to make a profit because the price of the good could be lower than their long-run average total cost. So not achieving economies of scale could prevent firms from entering. The second barrier to entry is patents and legal statutes. You probably won't be tested on patents, but there's still a good term to know. A patent is a legal statute that gives the inventor of something the sole rights to that. And the reason why patents are issued is because otherwise inventors could be worried that they have to invest a lot into making an invention. And once they've invented it, then other firms can copy what they made and they won't earn enough profits to offset the investment costs. And thus, patents give the firm the sole rights to that invention and prevent this. And other legal statutes could be in place in order to ensure safety. For example, electric companies are often monopolies because a government does not want two companies to manage the power grid in a city because that could be dangerous. And then a third barrier to entry is high startup costs. So if it costs a lot to start a company, then that makes it more difficult to start a company, which could be a barrier to entry. And the fourth is ownership of resources. So if one firm owns all the resources that are necessary to produce the product, then that could prevent other firms from entering because they don't have access to the resources necessary to produce the product. Now let's talk about the monopoly demand and marginal revenue curve. Since the monopoly is a price maker, depending on how many units of output it produces, in order to maximize profits, it would sell at the maximum price that ensures that it can sell all of its output. And that price is set by the demand curve. So as we can see here, if the monopoly were to produce 1 unit of output, it would sell at $8. If it were to produce 2 units of output, it would sell at $6, and so on. So to find the total revenue for each quantity, we multiply price and quantity. So for 1 unit of output, it's 1 times 8, which is 8. For 2, it's 2 times 6, which is 12, and so on. And then marginal revenue is the total revenue for the current quantity minus the total revenue for the previous quantity. So for 1 unit of output, it's $8. For 2, it's $4, and so on. If we graph this, we will see that the marginal revenue curve looks like this. So the marginal revenue curve slopes down faster than the demand curve. All right, and then now, how can the monopoly maximize its profits? Well, it would produce at the quantity where marginal revenue equals marginal cost and price at the demand curve price for that quantity. So since we see right here that marginal revenue and marginal cost intersect at 2 units of output, that's how much the monopoly will produce, and it will sell it at the demand curve price, which is $6. And now let's determine the economic surplus for the monopoly. Since we're selling 2 units at $6, these are the areas of the consumer and producer surplus. And notice how we have this area of deadweight loss, because we would have that additional area of economic surplus if this market was perfectly competitive. All right, and then a natural monopoly occurs when only one firm can achieve economies of scale or decreasing long-run average total cost. And since average total cost decreases throughout the entire effective demand of the product, as we saw in Unit 3, that means that marginal cost has to be below average total cost. A natural monopoly will make the same decisions as a monopoly to maximize profits. It would produce at the quantity where marginal revenue equals marginal cost and price at the demand curve price for that quantity. All right, and since we see the average total cost curve here, we can determine that this area is the profits. Price discrimination. So price discrimination is charging different prices for the same product. Some examples you see are charging different ticket prices depending on age and selling goods in different places with different prices. So let's suppose that we have this monopoly right here. If there was no price discrimination, then these would be the areas of the consumer and producer surplus. Now let's suppose that the first 100 units of output are sold in a store where the buyers are willing to pay more. So the monopoly prices it at $8 for those 100 units. And what that does is it turns this area, which was previously consumer surplus, into producer surplus. So overall, price discrimination increases producer surplus and decreases consumer surplus. Perfect price discrimination is charging each consumer the maximum they're willing to pay. And what that does is it makes the marginal revenue curve equal to the demand curve, because for the 100th unit of output, we sell it to the consumer who's willing to pay $8 at a price of $8. And for the 200th unit of output, we sell it to the consumer who's willing to pay $6 at a price of $6, and so on. And now, since marginal revenue and marginal cost intersect at this quantity, the monopoly produces this quantity of output. And all of this area is now producer surplus. So as we can see, with perfect price discrimination, all the consumer surplus is now gone, but this is allocatively efficient. Now we're moving into monopolistic competition, in which there are a large number of firms selling differentiated products and low to no barriers to entry. An example would be a restaurant, because there are a large number of restaurants and each restaurant makes its own foods. Usually demand is more elastic than for a monopoly because there are many close substitutes, but still the demand slopes down, as we can see in this graph, and marginal revenue slopes down faster than demand. And firms make the same decisions as a monopoly, so they would produce at the quantity where marginal revenue intersects marginal cost and charge the demand curve price for that quantity. And as we can see, since we have average total cost here, we can calculate that this is the area of profit. But what happens in the long term? Well, firms will either enter or leave until demand intersects ATC once at the quantity where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. All right, so in this case, firms will enter because, as we saw in the last slide, the firms make profit. And what that does is it reduces the demand for each individual firm's products, because now that people have more alternatives to choose from, the demand for each individual firm's products will go down. And eventually, at the quantity that each firm produces, they will be charging the same price as their average total cost, and hence the firms make a normal profit. And now, as you can see, this is not productively efficient because we're not producing at the minimum average total cost, which is the quantity where marginal cost intersects average total cost. Excess capacity is defined as the difference between the productively efficient quantity and quantity produced. Now we're getting into oligopolies, where there are a small number of firms selling identical or differentiated products. There's interdependence and high barriers to entry. Large companies that you can think of, such as Apple, Google, Samsung, those are oligopolies. Coke and Pepsi is an example of a duopoly, which means two firms. Oligopolies sometimes form cartels, which means they collude or make agreements, such as collectively raising prices and limiting quantity. And that gives the firms increased monopoly power. And that benefits the firms themselves, but antitrust laws often restrict cartels or make them illegal because the more monopoly power a firm has, the less efficient it is. And cartels are also unstable because firms may have an incentive to break an agreement out of own interest, and we'll see why soon. Since oligopolies are characterized by interdependence, a very relevant topic is game theory. So suppose that two firms are selling a similar product and can either set their price low or high. If both firms price high, they each earn $100 in profit. If one firm prices high and the other low, the firm that priced high earns $50 in profit, and the firm that priced low earns $130 in profit. This is because many more people will purchase from the firm that prices low. Whereas if both firms price low, they each earn $80 in profit, which is worse off than if they had both priced high. A payoff table shows all the strategies each firm can take and the results for each possible combination of strategies. So here are some relevant terms. A strategy is a course of action a firm can take. In this case, it's price low or price high for both firms. A dominant strategy is a strategy that will always produce a better outcome for a firm, regardless of what the other firm decides. In this case, firm A's dominant strategy is to price low, because if firm B prices low, then firm A should price low because they would earn $80 in profit, which is better than $50. Whereas if firm B prices high, then firm A should price low because they would earn $130 in profit, which is better than $100. So regardless of what firm B chooses, it's always better for firm A to price low. And the same applies for firm B. And this is why firms have an incentive to cheat. They might make an agreement to both price high because $100 is better than $80 for both pricing low. However, since each firm's dominant strategy is to price low, they could switch that strategy to benefit themselves. And a Nash equilibrium is a situation where neither firm can obtain a better outcome by changing their strategy, assuming the other firm doesn't change their decision. In this table, there is only one Nash equilibrium, which occurs when both firms price low. And let's see why this is true. To find Nash equilibria, for each firm, box the profit earned by its best strategy for every possible strategy for the other firm. Cells that are boxed by both firms are Nash equilibrium. All right, so let's start with firm A. If firm B prices low, then firm A should price low. So therefore, we box the $80 in profit that they would earn. And if firm B prices high, they should also price low. So we box the $130 in profit they would earn. And then same reasoning applies for firm B. They would box these two. And since the cell where both firms price low is boxed by both firms, that is the Nash equilibrium. Now keep in mind it's possible to have more than one or no Nash equilibria. But in this situation, since both firms have a dominant strategy, the one and only Nash equilibrium is when both firms use their dominant strategy. Now we're going to walk through an FRQ problem together. So we're given a payoff table, and there are three parts to this question. We'll start off with part A, which is asking, does each firm have a dominant strategy? If so, what is it? So for firm A, we consider if firm B decides to price low, then firm A should price low because 75 is better than 40. And if firm B prices high, then firm A should still price low. So therefore, firm A's dominant strategy is to price low. Whereas for firm B, we consider if firm A prices low, then firm B should price high because 80 is better than 70. But if firm A prices high, then firm B should price low. And therefore, firm B has no dominant strategy. All right, now part B is asking if the two firms do not collude, what will be their individual profits? All right, so each firm will seek to maximize their own profits, and therefore firm A will definitely choose their dominant strategy and price low. And firm B assumes that firm A chooses their dominant strategy and thus prices high. So therefore the result is this cell right over here. And firm A's profit is $120, while firm B's profit is $80. Now, part C is asking you, the government decides to offer a subsidy of $20 to any firm that prices low, and then asks you to redraw the payoff table. What would firm B decide to do? Explain. And what would happen to the profits for firm A? Explain. All right, so here is the redrawn payoff table. I've bolded the numbers that have changed. So firm B would price low because it's now their dominant strategy. And since the question asks you to explain, we should explain why it's their dominant strategy. If firm A prices low, firm B should price low because 90 is greater than 80. If firm A prices high, firm B should price low because 150 is greater than 110. And firm A's profit decreases because before the subsidy, firm A was making $120, and after the subsidy, both firms have a dominant strategy of pricing low, resulting in a profit of only $95 for firm A. All right, that's it for Unit 4. So here's a review. Pause to read over the points. Here's the important information about monopolies, natural monopolies, price discrimination, monopolistic competition, and finally, oligopolies. Now we're going to talk about factor markets, which is where firms purchase their resources or factors. There aren't many new concepts in this unit. It's mostly just using concepts you've already learned about, hence it's a great review for previous concepts. The demand for a factor is the amount of that factor, such as workers, that firms are willing to purchase at each price. And it follows the law of demand, because if firms have to pay more for a factor, then they would demand less of it. The demand for a factor is derived, meaning that it depends on the demand for something else, which in this case is the product. Because if the demand for their product is high, then the price of the product is high, making it very profitable. And thus, firms are likely to demand more factors to produce more of that product. The supply of the factor is the amount of that factor available at each price. And this follows the law of supply, because, for example, if the wage rate for a job is higher, then more people will be willing to take it. Here are the determinants for factor demand. First, the price of the product. So this is the concept of derived demand we just talked about. The productivity of the factors. So if the factors are very productive and can make more output and thus more profit, then firms will demand more of it, and substitute and complementary resources. And for factor supply, the determinants are workforce size. So if there are more people trying to find work, then there's a greater supply of workers. Education, because certain occupations require a specific degree of education for a worker to be in it. Alternative options, so that's other jobs that workers can take on. And preference for leisure. If people prefer more leisure time, then they would be willing to work less hours, and thus the supply is lower. Marginal revenue product, or MRP, is the additional revenue generated by one additional unit of the factor, and it's equal to marginal product times price in a perfectly competitive product market, because then the price of the product is fixed. Marginal resource cost, or MRC, is the additional cost for one additional unit of the factor, and it's constant in a perfectly competitive factor market, because then the price of the factor is set by the market. And MRP equals MRC maximizes profits. Let's look at an example of MRP. So we're given a table of the amount of workers, the output, and we're told the price of a product is fixed at $5. All right, so first we determine marginal product for each quantity of workers. And then we multiply each of those numbers by 5 to get MRP. And here is a side-by-side graph of a perfectly competitive factor market. And keep in mind that the MRP curve you see here does not show what you saw on the last slide. So as you can see, the price of the factor is set by the market, and it sets the MRC for the firm. All right, so now we're getting into total product maximization using MP analysis. So this is similar to something that we did in Unit 1. If a firm has a fixed budget and can choose between two resources, what is the optimal quantity of each? All right, so we just find the marginal product per dollar of each quantity of each resource. So we divide the marginal product values that have been provided by the cost of each resource. And then at each increment, we choose the resource with the higher marginal product per dollar until they will be equal in the end. So first we choose machines because 6 is greater than 3. And then we choose machines because 4 is greater than 3. And then 3 is greater than 2.4. 2.4 is greater than 2. And then we have 2 for each. And now we have spent $20,000. So this is the optimal quantity of workers and machines. The last topic for this unit is a monopsony labor market, in which there is only one firm employing workers, so it gets to decide what wage to pay its workers. And MRC increases faster than supply because purchasing additional workers requires raising wages for everyone. So this is basically the same thing as a monopoly, except now we're dealing with the supply and marginal resource cost curves instead of the demand and marginal revenue curves. So the firm, to maximize its profits, would employ at the quantity where MRC equals MRP, and then pay the wage of the supply curve at that quantity. And that's it for Unit 5. The entire review of Unit 5 is on this one slide, so pause to read over it. Now we're into our last unit of this video. This unit will cover problems that may occur in the market and what the government can do to resolve them. A market failure is when market forces fail to produce the allocatively efficient quantity of output. An example that we've already seen is imperfect competition. In the next slide, we'll see another example. And there are several methods that the government can use to intervene in the market. The first is a lump sum tax or subsidy, which is a fixed tax or subsidy that doesn't depend on the amount of the good produced and sold. And this will not affect marginal benefit, marginal cost, or profit maximizing output, but it does affect fixed costs and can therefore affect profits or losses. A per unit tax or subsidy will affect either the marginal benefit or marginal cost curve and therefore profit maximizing output. Taxes will decrease output, just like we've seen earlier in Unit 2, whereas subsidies will increase output. A price ceiling or floor, if it's binding, it will affect the profit maximizing output. And imposing regulations, that could affect the cost that businesses face or monopoly power. An externality is when an individual or individuals not involved in a market transaction are affected by the transaction, and these can result in a market failure. In a negative externality, the individual or individuals are negatively affected. For example, if a factory releases pollution, then the people living in the area will face increased pollution even if they're not involved with the good that the factory is producing. In a positive externality, the individual or individuals are positively affected. For example, streetlights ensure driver safety at night. Even though the drivers don't pay for the streetlights, they still face the benefit of them. Why do externalities result in a market failure? Well, for negative externalities, we have a marginal benefit curve, a marginal private cost curve, but we also have a marginal social cost curve that is higher than the marginal private cost curve, because production of the good comes at a cost to the individuals that are not involved in it, but still negatively affected by it. However, since businesses have the interest of maximizing profits, they will produce at the quantity where marginal benefit intersects marginal private cost. And the result is that the good is overproduced, and we have this area of deadweight loss, where the marginal social cost is greater than the marginal benefit. As for a positive externality, we have a marginal cost curve and a marginal private benefit curve, but the marginal social benefit curve is higher than the marginal private benefit curve because production of the good comes at the benefit to people who are not involved but positively affected. However, since businesses will work to maximize their own profits, they will produce at the quantity where marginal cost intersects marginal private benefit, and thus the good is underproduced, and we have this area of deadweight loss where the marginal social benefit is greater than the marginal cost. So now, how can the government intervene to correct externalities? Well, for a negative externality, the government should tax per unit to shift the marginal private cost curve up and reduce output to the allocatively efficient amounts. They can also set regulations, such as limiting the amount of pollution that can be released in order to shift the marginal private cost curve up. But if you're asked what the government can do to fix a negative externality on the AP test, generally the best answer is tax per unit. And then for a positive externality, the government should subsidize per unit to shift the marginal private benefit curve up and increase output to the allocatively efficient amounts. Now we're getting into government intervention in imperfectly competitive markets. So if we have a monopoly right here that is maximizing its profits, then we would see this area of deadweight loss right here. However, if the government wants the monopoly to produce the allocatively efficient output, then they would set a price ceiling at the price where demand intersects marginal cost. Because if they do that, then the monopoly will face a constant marginal revenue, which is equal to the price ceiling before they get to the allocatively efficient amount, and thus produce at the allocatively efficient amount. The government can also provide a per unit subsidy on the monopoly in order to get them to produce the allocatively efficient amount. So what that would do is it would shift the marginal cost curve down, because in the eyes of the monopoly, for every unit they're producing, they're spending less money because they're getting some of that money back in the form of the per unit subsidy. With these new curves, the monopoly produces at the allocatively efficient output in order to maximize its profits, and consumers pay less per unit of the good. When imposing a price ceiling on a natural monopoly, the government needs to be careful because the marginal cost is below the average total cost throughout the entire effective demand of the product. Without the price ceiling, the firm will produce at the quantity where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. If the government wants to increase allocative efficiency, they can set a fair return price ceiling, which is a ceiling at the price where demand equals average total cost, and this would cause the firm to make a normal profit because they would be charging the same amount per unit as their average total cost. If the government wants to set a ceiling at the socially optimal price, then the firm will produce at an economic loss because average total cost would be higher than the per unit price. So eventually, the monopoly would shut down, and this is what the government needs to be careful of. However, the solution to this is for the government to give a lump sum subsidy to the monopoly in order to offset the loss. Now we're getting into the types of goods. Goods have two characteristics. They're either rival or non-rival, depending on whether their supply is limited or effectively unlimited, and excludable or non-excludable, depending on whether people have to pay in order to access them. So rival and excludable goods are called private goods. Examples are food, homes, and cars. People have to pay for them to get them, and supply is limited. Rival and non-excludable goods are called common goods. Examples are playgrounds and fish in open area. Using playgrounds and going fishing are both free. You can't stop someone from doing it because they don't pay for it. However, if somebody was using a swing on the playground, then somebody else could not be using the same swing at the same time. And if somebody were to go fishing, then other people will not be able to catch the same fish that that person catches. So therefore, these goods are limited and rival. Non-rival and excludable goods are called artificially scarce goods, and examples are television service and internet. So these can serve a virtually unlimited number of people at once. Everyone around the globe can basically use them at the same time. However, in order to use them, people have to pay for television service and the internet. So therefore, they're excludable. And then finally, non-rival and non-excludable goods are public goods. Examples are streetlights, law enforcement, and national defense, because everyone faces the benefits of them without even having to pay for them. So there are two problems that can arise with the types of goods. The tragedy of the commons is that people overconsume common goods, such as overfishing and depleting the amount of fish left in the future. And the solution for this is the government can limit use. For example, giving permits that only allow a person to catch a certain number of fish each day. The free rider problem is people who benefit from non-excludable goods don't pay or underpay for them. And the result of this is that producers are not willing to produce them because they know that their consumers are likely to not pay them. So then the solution is that the government should fund the goods since no one else is willing to produce them. Last topic for this video, income inequality. The amount of income inequality in an economy can be described using the Lorenz curve and Gini coefficient. So suppose we have an economy with $100 and 5 people, and we listed the amount of money they hold from least to most. With that, we can find that the bottom 20% of people, which is person one alone, hold 5% of the total income. The bottom 40% of people, person 1 and 2, hold 15% of the total income. And with that, we can find the amount of income held by the bottom 60%, 80%, and 100% of people. To get the Lorenz curve, we plot the cumulative percentage of people on the x-axis and percentage of income held on the y-axis. Right now, the 45-degree line that you see here is the line of equality, and that represents what the Lorenz curve would look like if everyone held the same amount of income. But for our scenario, if we plot the points that we got and connect them, we get the Lorenz curve. So now the Gini coefficient. The Gini coefficient is proportional to the area in between the line of equality and the Lorenz curve. And for the purposes of this course, it will always be between 0 and 1. If some people had negative income, then theoretically it could be greater than 1, but that's beyond the scope of this course. The higher the Gini coefficient is, the more income inequality there is. If the Gini coefficient is 0, then that means perfect equality, which means everyone has the same amount of income. Whereas if the Gini coefficient is 1, then that's perfect inequality, or one person holds all of the income. How would taxes and other forms of government intervention impact inequality? Well, progressive taxes will decrease inequality because people with the higher income will be taxed a higher percentage of their income, and thus people with the lower income will now hold a larger percentage of the total income. An example of a progressive tax is income tax. Proportional taxes don't affect income distribution because people will still hold the same percentage of total income, and thus the Lorenz curve does not change. Regressive taxes will increase inequality because people with a lower income will be taxed a higher percentage of their income. An example is sales tax because it is constant and does not depend on income. And then transfer payments to people with lower income, such as healthcare or rental payment aid, can reduce inequality. Minimum wage and anti-discrimination laws can also reduce inequality because they aim for people to be paid more on par. However, the government needs to be careful of some adverse effects, such as increased unemployment, that can also increase inequality. So now we're into the final review of this video, Unit 6. Pause whenever you need to read over the points. Here's the important information about externalities. And then government intervention in monopolies, including natural monopolies, the types of goods, the Lorenz curve and Gini coefficient, and finally, the effects of government intervention on inequality. All right, that was the course. If you have any questions, feel free to leave them down below in the comments. Thanks for watching. I hope to see you in my other videos.